White silence. The snow did not feel like a threat at first. It arrived quietly, drifting down through the trees in wide, slow flakes, softening the forest until everything looked gentler than it should have. Sound faded almost immediately. Footsteps no longer echoed. Wind lost its sharpness. The world felt wrapped, contained, almost protected. That illusion lasted longer than it should have. Ethan noticed the silence before he noticed the cold. The forest no longer reacted to them. No distant bird calls, no creak of branches responding to movement. Just a thick, padded quiet that absorbed sound as soon as it was made. Even their breathing seemed muted. He slowed without meaning to. The others took a few more steps before stopping. No one said anything. They all understood at the same moment that the forest had changed. They had prepared carefully. The route had been walked before, in better weather. Maps were printed and laminated. GPS devices were fully charged, radios tested, extra food packed not for comfort, but for error. Winter clothing rated far beyond what the forecast suggested. Experience had taught them one thing clearly. Winter does not forgive optimism. What experience had not prepared them for was how fast conditions could strip meaning from preparation. The trail vanished under snow in less than an hour. Wind filled every depression, erased footprints, flattened landmarks. The compass still pointed north, but north was no longer useful. Every direction looked identical. Trees repeated endlessly, their shapes blending into one another. They kept walking because stopping felt like admitting something none of them wanted to say out loud. Cold deepened as daylight faded, not gradually, decisively. Temperature dropped as if the world had made up its mind. Fingers stiffened almost immediately. Breath crystallized on scarves and collars. Metal buckles burned exposed skin. Simple adjustments became clumsy, dangerous. Night arrived before they were ready. It felt early, too early. The fire almost failed. Wind tore at the flame the moment it appeared. Matches snapped. Lighters sparked uselessly. Wood that should have burned hissed and smoked, dampened by snow and moisture they hadn't noticed. Ethan's hands shook violently, not just from cold, but from the understanding that failure here would not be dramatic. It would be quiet. When the fire finally caught, it did not feel like safety. It felt like borrowed time. They huddled close, feeding it constantly, knowing sleep was a risk they couldn't afford. Snow fell steadily, building a wall of white around the firelight. Beyond it, the forest watched without interest. The first night stretched unnaturally long. Cold works inward. It finds gaps in clothing, in posture, in attention. It settles into joints, muscles, bone. Conversation died quickly. Words felt heavy, unnecessary, wasteful. Ethan listened instead. Branches cracked under snow load. Wind changed pitch. Somewhere far away, something moved and then stopped. The forest did not rush them. It waited. Morning brought no relief. The world was white and flat, stripped of depth and familiarity. Hills vanished. The sky blended into the ground at the horizon. Trees stood like copies of the same shape, repeated endlessly. They ate mechanically, forcing food into bodies that didn't want it. Hunger had not arrived yet. That came later. Movement resumed without discussion. Every step cost energy they did not have. By the second day, the cold had changed character. It was no longer sharp. It was dull, heavy. Speech shortened. Decisions slowed. Hands fumbled with tasks they had performed countless times before. One man dropped his glove and stared at it. As if unsure whether it mattered, Ethan recognized the signs. Hypothermia does not feel like panic. It feels like comfort, like relief. That frightened him more than anything else. When one of them sat down and didn't stand back up, Ethan felt something break inside him. "Up," he said sharply. The man looked annoyed, confused, as if the request was unreasonable. That was how it started. They forced movement, forced conversation, forced awareness. Ethan talked constantly, asking pointless questions, demanding answers, keeping voices active. Silence was dangerous now. The cold was no longer outside them. It was inside. The storm returned violently. Wind ripped through the forest, lifting snow from the ground and hurling it sideways. Visibility collapsed. Faces burned instantly. Breathing felt like inhaling glass. They moved blindly, guided by instinct rather than direction. The rock overhang appeared suddenly, barely noticeable until it blocked the wind just enough to matter. They pressed into it, bodies tight together, sharing heat, counting breaths, fighting the urge to close their eyes. Time lost structure. There was only noise and pressure. At some point during the night, Ethan realized he could no longer feel his feet. Not numbness, absence. He pressed his fingers hard against his boots, expecting pain. Nothing returned. He understood immediately what that meant. He said nothing. Fear would accelerate the damage. Instead, he moved his feet constantly. Tiny motions, desperate motions, just enough to keep blood flowing. The night did not end. It loosened its grip slightly. Morning arrived pale and quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the forest frozen in perfect stillness. Snow glittered faintly under weak sunlight. It was beautiful in a way that felt cruel. That was when Ethan saw it. A break in the trees, open ground, a frozen river cutting cleanly through the landscape. A line, direction. They followed the river because it was the only thing that made sense. Pain returned to Ethan's feet slowly, violently, each step sending sharp shocks through his legs. He welcomed it. Pain meant nerves. Nerves meant life. No one spoke. Talking wasted heat. They moved because stopping felt worse than pain. The search team found them late that afternoon. From a distance, they barely looked human, shapes moving too slowly, unevenly against the white. Life reduced to motion. Rescue felt unreal. Hands grabbing, voices shouting, blankets wrapped too tightly, warmth that burned instead of comforted. Ethan remembered screaming when someone touched his boots. Then nothing. Recovery took months. Frostbite healed unevenly. Strength returned slowly. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of endless white silence and wind moving where nothing should move. When people asked what it had been like, Ethan struggled to explain. The hunger wasn't the worst part. The cold wasn't the worst part. The storm wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how reasonable it felt to stop, how convincing the silence was. Winter didn't chase them. It didn't need to. It simply waited for them to decide they were done fighting it. Ethan woke up to warmth that felt unnatural, not gentle, not reassuring. It pressed against him from all sides, heavy and invasive, like something that refused to let go. Blankets wrapped around his body, too thick, too tight. The air smelled sterile, sharp, with antiseptic and metal. Somewhere nearby, a machine hummed steadily, indifferent to the fact that he had almost disappeared. He tried to move his feet. Nothing happened. For a second, Panic surged so fast it stole his breath. His mind raced ahead of his body, replaying the forest, the cold. The moment sensation had vanished completely. Hands held him down. "Easy," someone said. A calm voice. Practiced. Too controlled. "They're still there. You just can't feel them yet." Ethan closed his eyes, unsure whether that was reassurance or a warning. The days blurred together. Doctors came and went, explaining things slowly, carefully, as if speaking too fast might shatter something fragile. Frostbite, nerve damage, circulation issues, long-term recovery. Words layered over one another without forming meaning. Ethan listened, nodded, forgot. His mind never fully left the forest. It stayed with the wind, with the silence, with the moment standing still felt reasonable. The others recovered unevenly. One of them laughed too loudly, too often, as if noise itself could keep the cold away. Another barely spoke at all, eyes fixed on walls that didn't matter. One avoided sleep entirely, pacing the ward at night until exhaustion forced him to stop. They shared rooms, then visits, then silence. They didn't talk about the storm. They didn't have to. Every one of them knew what it meant to almost stop. Sleep became dangerous. When Ethan closed his eyes, the white returned instantly. Endless snow, flat light, no horizon, wind that moved without sound. Sometimes he dreamed he was still walking. Sometimes he dreamed he had stopped and felt nothing at all. The worst dreams weren't about dying. They were about deciding not to move. He woke gasping, heart racing, hands gripping sheets as if they were the last solid thing left in the world. Recovery demanded patience. Ethan didn't feel capable of giving. Physical therapy hurt in predictable ways. Muscles screamed. Nerves sparked unpredictably. Pain, at least, made sense. It followed rules. It had explanations. The quiet inside his head did not. It whispered, "You survived. You've earned rest. Stopping is allowed now." That voice sounded reasonable. That terrified him. When he was finally discharged, the world felt wrong. Too bright. Too loud. Too careless. Snow piled along sidewalks sent a sharp jolt through his chest. Wind against his face made him flinch before he could stop himself. He avoided open spaces instinctively, gravitating toward walls, trees, anything that felt like shelter. People smiled when they saw him walking. They called him lucky. Ethan smiled back because correcting them felt pointless. Luck had nothing to do with choosing not to stop. They met once a week at first. No schedule, no formal plan. Just the understanding that silence was easier to share with people who had stood in it before. They sat together, drank coffee they barely tasted, watched steam rise and disappear. Sometimes someone spoke about ordinary things, jobs, weather, appointments. No one mentioned the forest. The forest didn't need to be named to exist. Months passed. Sensation crept back into Ethan's feet slowly, unevenly. Some days were better. Others felt like setbacks. Pain flared without warning. Sharp reminders that his body remembered even when he wanted to forget. What never returned was certainty. Winter no longer felt neutral. It felt observant. One evening, nearly a year later, snow began to fall. Light flakes, harmless flakes, the kind people barely noticed. Ethan stood outside, longer than necessary, watched them settle on his coat. Cars passed. Footsteps continued. Life moved without hesitation. The silence pressed in, familiar and heavy. For a moment, the old thought surfaced. You could stop. Then he shifted his weight forward, one step, then another, not because he felt strong, because stopping no longer felt reasonable. Survival, he realized, hadn't ended in the forest. It had changed shape. It lived now in small, daily decisions, in continuing when nothing demanded it, in moving when stillness felt tempting, in choosing action over comfort, again and again. Winter hadn't tried to kill him. It had tried to convince him to stay still, and that lesson stayed with him long after the snow melted. Years later, Ethan would tell the story differently, not as an adventure, not as a warning, but as a quiet truth, that the most dangerous moment isn't when the storm arrives. It's when the world goes quiet and stopping feels like the right choice.